Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're doing very well tonight. That's right, it's evening. I'm recording this much later than I usually record. I am not caffeinated, which is unusual for me when I'm behind the microphone. Hopefully, that does not impact the quality of my commentary. I am feeling pretty good, pretty energetic for now. We'll see if I last the duration. We'll see if my energy flags. But for now, we are going to get into what seems to be a big month of BGX content with a very cool donation league, if I dare say so myself. So thank you so much in advance for watching, for being here. Thank you to all Patreon supporters, as always, including our two newest ones. New Unearthed tier member Moat. Thank you so much, Moat. And a brand new confidant as well, Eric Dawson. Thank you so much, Eric. Welcome to the fold, my friends. And thank you especially for this video to Guillaume Udaye, who is the tireless tier supporter and all-around really awesome, really cool, really laid-back guy whose donation league this is. And, Guillaume is one of many Francophone patrons, so when I mistake other non-Francophone people's names for a French name, maybe you can understand why. There are a lot of French speakers who do support this channel. Guillaume is one of them. Thank you so much, my friend. And Guillaume, I know he's an easygoing guy because he said, I want to see Abzan with Gilded Goose. I want to see Abzan Stoneblade with Gilded Goose, and other than that, you can do whatever you want. You can build the list yourself, you can bring it to the Discord and have people collaborate to build it, you can do live replay, I don't care when you play it. So very, very nice to have such an easygoing fellow with such a cool idea, Gilded Goose and Abzan. So of course, I took him up on this for sure when he earned the donation league and gave me that request. And I said, well, what is the real upside of Gilded Goose? So first of all, Gilded Goose in and of itself, this is the mid-range monodork, the best one this side of Deathrite Shaman. And basically, the whole reason monodorks never get played in a mid-range deck is because they reach steeply diminishing returns as you enter the mid to late game, where the mana ramp becomes less and less consequential until ultimately it doesn't matter at all, over the course of a normal game anyway. And they're also terrible top decks, so those are two things that we cannot afford generally when we are a mid-range deck trying to take the game long. Therefore, the only monodorks that really should interest us are ones like Deathrite Shaman, or indeed maybe like Gilded Goose, that can continue to generate value into the mid and late game after having helped us smooth out our plays or even power them out ahead of schedule early on. So that is the whole concept behind Gilded Goose, and it got the gears turning, and I was saying, okay, we all know that Abzan can be a clunky deck. We all know that Stoneforge Mystic is powerful, but she's also a clunky card. So my first thought was that Gilded Goose is actually a pretty interesting fit in Abzan, and the presence of Goose makes me want to go all in on a Stoneforge Mystic package. So that's what we've got here. Full 4 playset of Stoneforge and 3 pieces of equipment. Batterskull, Fire and Ice are pretty stock. Feast and Famine. We had some discussion about this versus Light and Shadow, but Feast and Famine, a very powerful sword. This was my vote, and as I'll explain a little bit, it was kind of a community thing. But anyway, so Gilded Goose, the first thing I decided was all in on Stoneblade package, and the second thing I decided was that it's actually a really tasty proposition, and maybe this is because I've been playing a little bit of Gruul or Ponza lately, but it's actually a really tasty proposition to power out Planeswalkers ahead of curve. Liliana of the Veil turn 2, very oppressive against a lot of decks, so my thinking was, why don't we play a much heavier Planeswalker presence than we ever normally would in Abzan to maximize the potentiality of turn 2 or maybe turn 3 4-drop Planeswalker with Gilded Goose. So to that end, we're on 3 Liliana of the Veil. My first thought was 4, but as we added things, we needed to make cuts, and Abzan does kind of like to keep its hand full. It doesn't really tend to dump out the hand all that quickly, so maybe ticking up with Lily is not going to be always that free, especially because we are down to 2 copies of Lingering Souls. So 3 Veil, 1 Last Hope, who I think broadly is a good fit in Abzan, and again, can be way more oppressive, especially against small creature decks if you can power her out on turn 2. And then I'm really excited about the top end of Vraska, Golgari, Queen, Gideon Ally of Zendikar. Gideon Ally is just a generically strong, white, fair, grindy card that often sees play in Abzan because he makes knights and they can pick up swords, and so can he, and he just pumps out value. And of course, getting him out ahead of curve with Goose is great. And then Vraska Golgari Queen, again, benefits from potentially getting cast ahead of schedule, but also has an amazing +2 synergy, not only with Lingering Souls, not only with like excess lands like she always does in BGX, but also with Gilded Goose. Cashing in a food token to gain a life and draw a card and add 2 loyalty to a planeswalker seems really good. In fact, if you are flush with things to do but you want to keep pulling ahead and you don't really have the luxury to activate Goose anytime soon, you can cash in the Goose itself too. So Vraska definitely a very clean fit in the deck. So following Guillaume's, laissez-faire approach, I conceived of those ideas myself and then brought it to my Discord and said, hey guys, this is our project. Does anyone want to brew it with me? And it was so fun. We brewed on stream. My moderator, Dan, hosted and shared his screen, and there was a bunch of us on the call all piling in. Everybody who contributed had awesome ideas, and I think we implemented at least one idea from every single person in the chat, so great job, guys. You know who you are. Thanks for being there. Let's cover the rest of the deck real quick. We have a 19, 17, 15 color distribution of black, green, and white, respectively, and our utility comes in the form of actually an 8th fetch land, 7 being stock on Abzan. I wanted more synergy with Gilded Goose. I guess it's not synergy, but a broader ability to fetch basic forest turn 1, which we otherwise not want in a stock Abzan list. But more importantly, it comes in the form of 2 silent clearings and 1 Indatha Triome, which I included as a mana fixer. You know, we do have somewhat extreme mana demands, if nothing else, because we're main decking Gideon, right? And Indatha Triome, we almost registered 22 lands. This is the 23rd land, basically, so it's giving us some flood insurance as well, because you can cycle it. And otherwise, we have 4 push, no path main deck, only 1 path sideboard. We are committing to being an attrition deck. Don't want to give the opponents a land. I don't think we need it. Having access to a path out of the side as supplementary removal is great, but I don't want to shy away from push to include path. I think push is really good right now. 4 Inquisition, 2 Thoughtseize. So between the Stoneblade package, the life gain potential of Goose, and all that stuff we just mentioned, we are definitely pretty well configured against red deck wins archetypes. 4 Tarmogoyf as well, and do note that also as a result of some Discord discussions, in this case a poll, I have switched to Future Sight Tarmogoyf, and while I was at it, taking advantage of the reprint, Lorwyn Thoughtseize, so we are going classic mode on the channel with the original printings henceforth. Typical split for decks that I usually am involved in building, with 1 Decay, 2 Trophy, 1 Pulse, and a 1 of Grim Flayer, which is a really spicy suggestion, and we ended up squeezing him in. He carries swords really well. He's got good synergy with Lingering Souls, and broadly a good fit in Abzan decks, right? So that's the main deck. We've covered everything else. I guess we'll remark on this, only 2 Lingering Souls. I think Lingering Souls is a really strong card in Abzan, and great alongside the Blades, right? But when we're going heavy on the Stoneblade package and heavy on the Planeswalker package, something had to make way, and Lingering Souls is kind of outclassed if the opponent isn't trying to trade 1 for 1. Like if they're playing huge haymakers like Uro, Lingering Souls is outclassed, and since we already have kind of a weak permanent ×3 in the form of Gilded Goose most of the time, Lingering Souls, to me, a natural cut. Sideboard, 3 Plague Engineer, who I really like in Abzan, arguably more than in any other BGX variant. I think he fits here arguably best. And alongside another staple, 2 times Ashiok, these are cards that is also going to be great to power out turn 2 in a lot of situations on the back of Goose. Rounding it out, 2 Nihil Spellbomb and 2 Choke, another great turn 2 Choke, sounds really, really tasty to me, and 1 each of Brutality, Duress, Path to Exile. Eidolon of Rhetoric, which is a kind of left field suggestion that came from myself, but seems really good, especially potentially turn 2, thinking more than anything against Prowess decks, but Storm, and there are other candidates here as well. And Celestial Purge, which is another great suggestion from the group. Really well-positioned card right now. Finally, a Kaya's Guile, which is a main deckable card, but I think in our build, committing more to the board, it belongs more on the side if we're going to play it. And as it turns out, we're going to play it. So this is going to be a replay, and we are going to dive right into it. Thank you once again, Guillaume. Thank you to everybody else. Let's play some Abzan Gooseblade. Okay, round 1, game 1, my friends, and look at all of our interaction. 2 push, 2 Inquisition, a Liliana the Last Hope off of 2 lands. So we hope our pushes line up. If not, double Inquisition really should, right? And the opponent mulligans all the way down to 5, which is great. So Overgrown Tomb means we've got all 3 colors online, combined with this lovely Onslaught basic plains. And we are against Gruul Midrange, also known as Ponza. They took the deep mulligan looking for acceleration, still didn't end up with it. 2 lands, Klothys, God of Destiny, Magus of the Moon, Scavenging Ooze. So some scary cards in a vacuum, but in practice, if we take the Klothys, we've got Inquisition for the follow-up Magus, and then we've got Fatal Push for Ooze when it does come down. So as long as they don't top deck anything else too crazy, famous last words against this deck, I know, we could be okay. We top decked Blooming Marsh, which is awesome. It's going to let us Inquisition again, and push the Ooze when it comes down next turn. We see the opponent has drawn Glorybringer, a good card, but not one that we are anywhere near being on the receiving end of. So OP is going to play out a basic forest, play the Ooze on the end step. It'll get pushed. We draw Batterskull. An awkward draw, and I'll spoil something by saying this is just keep an eye out for how many times we naturally draw or open on equipment. That is definitely the clunkiest single thing about Abzan. But in any case, we're still doing really well. Opponent does make the 3rd land drop, but their 1 unknown is not a 3 drop, so they say go. Side note, I play this same mountain, exact mountain in Jund. It's a beautiful Onslaught mountain. We gotta praise Ornate Puzzles, our opponent. They're taste in basics, and they've got a really cool matching John Avon Forest from the same set as well. But meanwhile, we make our 4th land drop. We tick Liliana the Last Hope up. We're hanging on to our Fatal Push. And Batterskull was an awkward draw, but at least it gives us something to put excess lands to if we draw those. We otherwise wouldn't want to. But this turn we don't draw land 5, we draw Stoneforge Mystic. So let's go get Fire and Ice, which I think is the card to get in this situation. There's an argument for maybe Feast and Famine to get cards out of their hand if they're stuck in hand, but if they're having cards stuck in hand anyway, Fire and Ice seems like just impossible to answer. Turns out it doesn't really matter because we've got the equipment starting to come down next turn. We've got Liliana the Last Hope threatening ultimate, and opponent's hand is just too clunky to do anything. So Gruul taking a deep mulligan, keeping a hand that could get there some of the time against some decks, but not against double Inquisition, Fatal Push in the first 2 turns. Conservative sideboarding is usually the order of the day against Gruul with BGX, and to that end, we trim a couple Planeswalkers, 1 each of Veil and Hope, and we bring in the Path and the Purge, just reducing the amount of cards that could potentially be too clunky to leverage or even stuck in hand in the face of land destruction, moon effects, etc., especially on the draw. I believe that to be correct. We've got a hand that's kind of a medium keep, unless they do this, unless they play turn 1 Arbor Elf, and then it becomes a good keep, because we push them, which is great for us. We're all set up for a turn 2 Tarmogoyf, which will survive Bolt. It even survives Wild Slash right now, because it's a 3-4 without a sorcery in the yard. But opponent did keep 7 this time, and they will play another Arbor Elf and another land. So looks like they're going to be able to at least cast 3 drops this game. And we have just kind of, despite the good 1-2 punch, we don't really have much else in hand, do we? So opponent going off here, they Utopia Sprawl, untap it, and then they Chandra it, and minus taking care of our Goyf. Always feels bad when you can't quite grow the Goyf large enough to survive the Chandra downtick, because she's so good ticking back up that losing our biggest and best threat to her is always pretty rough. But we do have a pretty good turn 3 because we rip another Goyf right off the top. We're playing out some basic lands. We are fairly well insulated against Magus of the Moon between the natural basics, including the swamp we fetched, and the food token from Goose. And speaking of Goose, we've played that out as well. But the opponent is going to town over there. We haven't disrupted them enough, and they've got half of a grip, so what are they going to do? Well, the first thing they do, in my opinion, is a misplay. They tick up with Chandra, but they have not activated with Arbor Elf first. I believe this is correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way Chandra is templated, even online, is you have to have the mana already at your disposal. You do not receive priority after she reveals the card. In other words, opponent has 4 mana, but if they flip a 5-drop with Glorybringer, they don't receive, like Glorybringer, they don't receive priority, so they cannot Arbor Elf, untap the forest, and then cast Glorybringer. It would have gone into exile, right? Fortunately for OP, it's just a mountain, so it is just a bad top deck out of the way, 2 damage to us. And then they double spell, stomping and flame slashing the Tarmogoyf. And then I'm thinking here comes Bone Crusher Giant, but in fact it is Seasoned Pyromancer. So I said that we had a decent turn 3, but that's what like a really powerful turn 3 looks like. So we are just getting completely crushed here. And we draw yet another land for turn, so I'm like, okay, I guess we're just cycling Indatha Triome, and look at that, another land off the top. That's just enough for me, so hey. Couple Tarmogoyfs, they had the answers to them. They will not always, but, you know, they had the answers to them, and they were generating X for 1s along the way. There's 3 we're looking at right here. They had 3 X for 1s in the first 4 turns with Chandra, Spyro, and Bone Crusher Giant, all at least 2 for 1, and meanwhile we are flooded. So sometimes having an excess of lands can be good against the deck, but certainly not there. Sideboarding did change a bit on the play for us, my friends. I brought back the Last Hope, and I also brought in our one of Collective Brutality, which I do rate more highly on the play. And to make way for that, we cut a couple of Lingering Souls, not needing, hopefully, to take as much of a defensive posture here when we are on the play. Both players will keep 7, and will shock in Inquisition the opponent, and I tanked over this decision for a long time. You can see why, I hope. The opponent has kept a 1-lander, but it's got 3 forms of acceleration, Arbor Elf, Double, Utopia Sprawl. They also have 3 other cards we care enormously about. Relic is not only really good against us, especially with our Tarmogoyf set to come down potentially T2, it's also just a way for them to cantrip and find a second land, which no matter what else we take, if we don't take Relic, can be a way for them to curve out despite whatever disruption might otherwise be forthcoming from us. Abrade is always an issue for us when we're on Stoneforge Mystic, and Seasoned Pyromancer is the X for 1 in hand, right? On top of that, Arbor Elf is kind of the way to attack their ramp from the perspective of, like, this is what's redundant and this is their highest upside play too. But it would feel bad to take it when we've got a deck full of kill spells, and we've got Liliana the Last Hope who could maybe tick up and take away the elf. I don't think taking away only 1 Utopia Sprawl makes sense, because one other option that we have is letting them stack up sprawls, hoping they can't do too much damage, and then trophying their lone land. So much to think about. I ended up taking the Arbor Elf for some of the reasons we outlined there, and we'll just have to see what happens. But OP will fetch up a basic, play Utopia Sprawl, no surprises there. And back over to us, we draw another Stoneforge Mystic, looking pretty clunky, right? So I go and get a basic. I do reason that a moon is one of the ways we can definitely lose here, and at least being able to cast subsequent Tarmogoyfs would be nice. But even that was a kind of a tricky decision, because should we maybe get a second black to guarantee Lily off any third land? It's really hard to say. But OP has made their second sprawl, played the Relic, and we draw the third land. So that's pretty nice, but we actually probably don't want to play Lily here. We probably want to go for the big blowout of trophy, hit their land, they'll get a land to replace it, right? But both of the sprawls, of course, will be destroyed. So opponent going to shrink our Goyf a little bit with a Relic, that's fine. I don't want to trophy main phase because I don't want them to get an untapped land, crack Relic on our turn, and then have 2 looks at another land, right? I want them to be as mana screwed as possible for as long as possible. So to that end, I wait for the draw step. This might actually have been a little bit bad. It's just kind of force of habit, but Gruul plays an enormous amount of basics. Probably should have upkept it, right? In any case, we're going to trophy. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Opponent's just floating mana. Yeah, they're going to Relic, and then they're going to Braid the Goyf, and that's going to suck, but, you know, we're still going to set them so far back on lands. It's going to be fine. Nope. Wrong. Veil of Summer. Everything sucks. I hate everything. And I just, like, you can imagine what my thinking was here. So opponent, I'm going to tell myself that opponent just drew that. You know, they just had that in there as their unknown in hand, and us waiting to the draw step didn't matter, right? But, oh boy, if us waiting to the draw step did matter, that's a real feel bad. The upside here is that after that, the opponent still doesn't have a second land to play, so they're operational with 3 lands, but no more than that. Doesn't look like they drew another one for turn either, so we just play Stoneforge Mystic. Go get a Batterskull, and unfortunately our 1/2 Goyf will then die to their Abrade. But that's all they've got for turn, so they do kind of have to take that kill while they can. Killing a Tarmogoyf with any 1-for-1 removal spell for Gruul is really important. But, yeah, they're having some really clunky turns despite blowing out our Veil. It's time for another Stoneforge Mystic because we've been fortunate enough to draw a 4th land. So now we can pass, hold up an activation with the current, or with the pre-existing SFM, and then opponent is priced into Spyro. Spyro with a full hand is never really that ideal, but clearly they're digging for a way to smooth out the clunk. They pitch Scooz, Glorybringer, still a full grip, 6 cards in hand, but still no other lands, so opponent was able to survive our blowout, but is still getting punished for keeping a 1-lander. And now with them tapped out, we pretty clearly go for Batterskull. We draw Tarmogoyf, which is great, but I'm going for the sicko mode play. We're going for the dual-wielding Germ. So we flash in with Stoneforge, the Fire and Ice, and then we equip it to the Germ, and then it is a 6/6 pro-blue Vigilance lifelink with an on-hit. And even though they have a wide board, we've got protection from the wide board, so I pointed upstairs because that puts them exactly dead to just 1 more hit. The insane power of the equipment really showing up here, and we've drawn Inquisition off the proc. So opponent needs some way to answer equipment to stay alive, and to be fair, they have it. They have Cindervines, and they also have another land, so they let the floating mana expire, and they go to our turn. We're going to begin with an attack here. We have a huge variety of ways to sequence, but clearly they're going to Cindervines the sword, or they're going to die. So that would be the play, I guess, to make them to start things out. And indeed, we do, so we kill a token in combat, we gain 4 life. Then we're going to follow up with an Inquisition. So this was actually really unclear. I think Liliana the Last Hope ticking up to kill an elemental, holding up Path to Exile, trying to just deal with their board as much as possible is totally fine. But I also know that Gruul is a deck with a lot of really scary cards. And we know they're playing at least a Braid for other artifact removal. We can afford to play reactively if we have good information and if it makes sense to, because remember, we want to be able to bounce the Batterskull potentially in response to removal, or at least threaten that. We're also able to hold up other things. So for all those reasons, I do decide to Inquisition, and we see a really scary hand, 2 Pillage, 2 Bloodbraid Elf, and a Chandra. So obviously we can only take the Pillages, we'll take one of those, but the knowledge of that other Pillage means we're not going to tap out for Liliana or Tarmogoyf this turn. We're just going to say go and see what the opponent's got to do. Opponent will play Chandra. Kind of didn't expect it. Kind of expected a Bloodbraid Elf if they weren't going to go for the Pillage and at least make us bounce Batterskull. Once again, opponent ticks up without having fetched with the Windswept Heath, so they cannot cast the Arbor Elf that they flip. The 2 damage doesn't matter at all. That just puts us back to 20. We have Batterskull. And playing the Arbor Elf, I think, actually would have been relatively relevant, just because they need all the blockers they can get. So, end step, we are going to flash in a Sword of Feast and Famine, and then with our remaining mana, it's time to Path the Spyro. Obviously, there are scarier targets in their deck, but in this case, we have them on the ropes. We're going to try to be ruthless, keep the board as clear as possible. We draw Maelstrom Pulse. That's a good, like, back pocket draw to have, but I don't think we strictly need it right now. So, once again, a few different ways you could sequence, but I think now it's time for Lily the Last Hope. It's a really clean +1 tick up. We know their whole hand, and now we can get Chandra off the field, which I do believe is priority number 1. Our squires are getting angry, so Squire assisting a Germ, squiring for the Germ, if you will, taking Chandra down. The other Squire puts them to 7, the Fetch will put them to 6. Our Batterskull can now die to Pillage, but if that's what they have to spend their turn doing, I don't think that's that bad for us. Look at our board, look at our hand, right? And at the same time, maybe we are just pricing them into Pillage. So sure, Pillage is what happens. I think we accept that. We know they can't cast the Bloodbraid Elves in hand unless they've drawn a land. And they haven't, they've drawn Klothys. A little bit too slow, we hope, right? So we untap, we draw Goose. Not that big a deal, or I should say not that good of a draw, right? But it's Goose time, and then it's Goyf time, and then it's sort of Feast and Famine time. Not only powering up one of our Stoneforge Mystics, we get a Bloodbraid out of the hand, and we get to untap all of our lands, giving us a great little turn of mill with Liliana, buy back a Goyf, play a Goyf, play a Gilded Goose. We've just got everything, and the opponent is at 2. So what can they put together besides a really nutty hit from Bloodbraid Elf? I'm really not certain, but one of them's gone, here comes the other. They're just cascading into Arbor Elf, it's no big deal. And they have one unknown in hand, and it's a Lightning Bolt. They take care of Liliana the Last Hope. Not sure it's the right hit, not sure it really matters, even if we didn't have the Maelstrom Pulse, but because we have the Pulse, it definitely doesn't matter. We pulse away the Bloodbraid Elf, Klothys goes back to sleep, and the Arbor Elf is gonna lay down his arms and surrender in the face of this army. So, really good win here, round 1 against Gruul. The Stoneforge Mystic package really just carrying us here, and our disruption lined up pretty well, which is not always the case. We took advantage of a deep mulligan in game 1, and in games 2 and 3, the opponent did keep 7, overran us in G2, but here in G3, despite them keeping 7, we had, and despite like a blowout Veil of Summer on their part, which would have been the nail in their coffin if they didn't have it, our disruption was still enough for us to get over the line pretty comfortably, as it turns out in the end. So, Stoneforge Mystic and Tarmogoyf. Note how good Stoneforge was, but also note how good Tarmogoyf was. This card is just a 2-mana 6/7 against a red deck in this matchup. So it's important to have 8 premier threats, which we do here, and which is more than we can say. Maybe for, like, Dead Guy Ale, certainly, which only has Stoneforge as a premier threat. Maybe even for Rock, because are any of the Rock threats overall on the power of Stoneforge Mystic for 2 mana or less? I would say no. So, just goes to show a lot of the good things about this deck. They were evident here in round 1. See you for round 2. It's round 2, and we are on the draw with a pretty good hand if they play to the board. And the opponent goes Swamp into Cabal Therapist. Not a play you see very often, but Cabal Therapist is not a threat to our hand on the first turn, so we take this opportunity to get our tap land down and to say go. We've drawn Tarmogoyf. So we've got a really low curve hand. We've got a handful of really, like, high impact stuff. We'll just have to see what the opponent's up to. I confess that at first glance I had no idea. OP will fetch, Kraken for 1 with Menace, and then Satyr Wayfinder, milling over some very interesting cards. Bloodghast, Fiend Artisan, and Gravecrawler, along with an additional Cabal Therapist. So OP just going wild over there, right? Having seen more of the deck, I think it is wise to push the Cabal Therapist before anything else happens, partially because our hand is so good. So we do that at the expense of getting a threat down, but we're hoping that we can push something relevant again this turn, and the opponent will then return the Bloodghast, Kraken for 1, they're chipping in with some stuff, and then the Bauble makes me fear the worst. This is, the Bauble made me kind of wince because it made me think that I am getting punished for my play. I don't know if I want to call it a misplay, because I think like getting the Blooming Marsh down there in general just makes plenty of sense. But I did not have Lurrus on my radar at all. Maybe I should have, but the point is, if we had played Fetchland, pushed the Therapist off of Triome, we could then have had an efficient turn of end step, crack the Fetchland, push the Lurrus as well. Instead, we kind of waste a mana, but that's okay, because playing a 2-drop here makes a lot more sense than playing Liliana anyway. So, main phase, we push the Lurrus. Gotta stop that value loop while we can. And then it's either Goyf or Stoneforge Mystic. If our life total was under a lot of pressure, I would probably be priced into playing the Goyf just as a really big blocker. But I said, let's take the opportunity to get our 2-for-1 and to threaten Batterskull. Let's basically also give the opponent an interaction check. Do they have a way to beat Stoneforge before Batterskull is going to get flashed in next turn? And or to beat a resolved Batterskull, I'm not certain. But opponent's doing mega spicy things over there. Satyr Wayfinder into Witch's Cottage to buy back Lurrus, put Lurrus to the top, and then Carrion Feeder. So I don't know what to call this deck. Maybe before I upload it, I will look it up to see if it's got a title. I was talking a little bit to the opponent. I asked Tom ACP if this was his brew, and he said yes. So major shout out to the opponent for a pretty cool brew. And right now it looks like Hogaak-less Hogaak is what I would call it. It's kind of like the core of the old Hogaak deck, minus the namesake card, right? But we draw the 4th land, which you'll note is pretty important in this deck. I think I'm kind of glad that we did go with 23 lands, because hitting that 4th land drop is pretty sweet. Means we get to play Goyf and then also hold up our Stoneforge activation. Now, we better use the Stoneforge activation in response to Cabal Therapist, because they know we tutored Batterskull. So that's what we're going to do. We flash in the Batterskull in response. Note the amazing synergy with Bloodghast relative to Cabal Therapist and to Carrion Feeder and stuff. It's just a real engine in a deck like this. And of course, it's put in the graveyard by other cards and comes back for free. So we flash in. The opponent then blind names Sword of Fire and Ice like a total boss. Not even worried about like Feast and Famine granting protection from all of their colors or anything like that. They're just like, nah, we know you have Fire and Ice. And indeed we do. Opponent looping Bloodghast over there, getting a free counter on Carrion Feeder before their land drop. And then it's the Lurrus we knew was coming. And Lurrus is going to buy back Fiend Artisan, which is a 6/6. So the opponent going really crazy on us over there. And we just draw a land, which is pretty bad. But the one consolation is they knew our hand. They could snipe something out of it with Cabal Therapist, and now instead we just get to dump it all out. So Grim Flayer still only a 2/2. Liliana pretty bad against this deck. We actually have some incentives to start chewing through the board, but with only one unknown in hand, I'm like, okay, maybe this is a high-impact card, let's take up. And it turns out to be Bloodghast, so we are punished for that, but whatever. Again, Liliana not very good either way. So we'll see what opponent rips off the top. But I guess before they play anything from hand, it is tutor time. Fiend Artisan tutor Stixure Supplier. Stixure Supplier mills a few things, but notably it mills Altar of Dementia. Opponent will then use Lurrus to buy Altar of Dementia back, and this is like the original, like, Bridge from Below Hogaak version in some ways, with Altar involved, right? But Fiend Artisan, very synergistic with Altar. I wonder if you can see it. At this stage, we have no choice but to try to chew through the board while we can. We're damned if we do, damned if we don't, basically. They get value off of the Stixure Supplier being sacrificed to Liliana. The draw of Lingering Souls is actually somewhat interesting there if the opponent doesn't have a nutty turn next turn, just because then we can equip a flyer with Batterskull and start winning the race that way. But, the opponent's got a lot to do here, and they're going to kick it off with a Supplier, milling a Bauble, and then tapping, untapping, tapping, untapping. There's another Supplier, there's Bloodghast, and here's a Fiend Artisan tutoring another Fiend Artisan. The Artisans are getting huge, and then it's time to sack their entire board to Altar of Dementia. And we've got 37 cards in the deck by the time I scoop, and that is just going to do it. So the go wide, recursive strategy. Definitely very, very strong against a deck that's often trying to 1-for-1 with destroy spells and with discard like we are. Lurrus as an engine needs no introduction in terms of how strong it is. And then on top of that, you have a win, basically a win con that's pretty inevitable if we can't destroy it in the context of their deck in the form of Altar of Dementia. So we had a pretty good progression, but the opponent completely crushed us here in round 1. Alright guys, so if the Gruul sideboarding was conservative, this is extremely radical. We're bringing in almost everything in our sideboard, and that means 3 Plague Engineer, 1 Collective Brutality, Path to Exile, Celestial Purge, 2 Ashiok, 2 Nihil Spellbomb, and a Kaya's Guile for a total of 11 cards coming in. Only Chokes, Duress, and Eidolon of Rhetoric stay on the bench, and the cards that come out are as follows: 2 Trophy, 2 Thoughtseize, 3 Liliana of the Veil, 1 each of Gilded Goose, Fatal Push, and also the 2 Lingering Souls. Don't remember if I mentioned those. So some really heavy sideboarding against this deck. Feels good to have a ton of sideboard cards here. Feels really good if this deck is back to be on 3 Plague Engineer as well, because obviously he shores us up against the Tribes and the X1 decks really well, but also he's really good against decks like this, against the old Hogaak shell, especially with Hogaak itself no longer with us. We will keep a great hand of 3 lands, 3 sideboard cards, and an Inquisition. Seems really good on the play. And we see some interaction out of the opponent. No surprise post-side. They have a card like Maelstrom Pulse. And they got a pretty good hand, too. It's also a 3-lander with Lurrus, Therapist, and Fiend Artisan. So there's a few options there, but ultimately Lurrus, I think, is just the take. He's the one that's going to grind us out, right? So Cabal Therapist, Blooming Marsh, we draw Gilded Goose, which is definitely a nice mana-efficient play, allowing us to deploy Goose, also deploy Spellbomb, say go, and note that Goose also allows us to hold up the Spellbomb activation starting next turn, despite being tapped out. Like, we can play a 3-drop next turn and still hold up the Spellbomb cantrip, the cantrip aspect of it, I should clarify. OP just jamming that Fiend Artisan here. And they're going to pass. They did not dare to blind name with Cabal Therapist. So an interesting decision point here, and I debated over a couple different things, but I actually decided to Spellbomb first. And Cantrip, because we don't want to lose out on the value. Gilded Goose allows us to get away with this. So why did I Cantrip so aggressively? Well, it is to shrink Fiend Artisan to a 1/1, because remember, it grows based on creatures in their graveyard. Lurrus was in the graveyard, so now we can say Plague Man naming Nightmare. It's a nice clean way to answer a card that's a huge problem for us on both axes on which it exists, right? The tutor aspect and the like Tarmogoyf of their deck aspect both can be a little tough to handle. So we draw 4th land, and as mentioned, that's never really that bad of a thing, but for now it's just an Ashiok. We're going to mill the opponent, and we get some stuff out of there, including Vengevine, which we didn't see game 1. Not a real surprise to see that, but kind of strange not to have seen any G1. Can't imagine their sideboard, though. End step, opponents got an Abrupt Decay. And then they're also going to blind name with Cabal Therapist Fatal Push, which I don't think is necessarily like a great name under the circumstances personally, but you do understand it's like, okay, they want to see our hand, they want to take something, anything with Cabal Therapist, and maybe Push is likely to be in our hand, but I don't necessarily, I sideboarded one out, right? It's not like the highest value card, so I have mixed feelings about that, but in any case, the point is they then have knowledge of our hand to resolve the second one, and Ashiok number 2 goes by the wayside. So, unfortunately for us, even though we've done a lot that's good, we've gone through 3 graveyard hate cards, and part of that is my aggressive use of Spellbomb to make Plague Mana kill spell. But hey, the opponent just plays another Cabal Therapist, so not the scariest. We know Maelstrom Pulse is the last card in their hand, and we draw Stoneforge Mystic, which is a good draw, and I'm going to go get Sword of Fire and Ice because they have the option to name whatever I get with this Therapist, and I would rather lose Fire and Ice to the Therapist and keep Batterskull in the deck than vice versa. So, important to know how to play around this card. We are seeing it being put to really good use here. This is one of the best shells I've ever seen for it. At the same time, it is kind of a limited card, not that exciting overall. And the opponent is priced into using the Pulse here, because if they don't, they're just going to lose it to the Feast and Famine next turn if we draw, or even if we don't draw a land, right? Because if they leave Stoneforge Mystic alive, we can do the Stoneforge thing and equip, so they just pulse away Mystic, and they've drawn land for turn, so they're out of ideas, and look at us, we draw another Stoneforge Mystic. Definitely not bad, but definitely not as good as using good old Gilded Goose to cast and then equip Sword of Fire and Ice with the Plague Man, and then untap all of our lands, and then we get to go cast a Stoneforge Mystic and go get a Batterskull, right? So we're having some awesome results so far with Feast and Famine. Definitely very, very cool. Opponents found a 4-drop off the top. It's Vengevine. It's more individually powerful than most of their other cards they could draw there. But I guess at this point, they probably need to draw yet more interaction, and they aren't. So we're going to flash in the Batterskull here. And then I actually make a terrible equipment because or a terrible re-equip, rather, because my mind was a fire with the same type of play that we saw in game 1 or in round 1, where we've got Batterskull and Sword of Fire and Ice. Here I want the Germ to have the taste of Feast and Famine alongside with Batterskull, but of course we're supposed to do that after we attack. Bad move, Grim Flayer. Just a misclick, just a mental shortcut that ended up being very bad, but it doesn't matter because we are so far ahead. Whatever the opponent drew, not a catch-up card, so we do get there in game 2 on the strength of a combination of sideboard and main deck cards. And, opponent did put Cabal Therapist to good use, but because they were 1-for-1ing us with cards like Decay and Pulse, and also 2-for-1ing themselves in places with Therapist, we proved to really outvalue them in a serious way. You're in the rubber match against Hogaak-less Hogaak, or whatever we'd like to call it, and we have a pretty sweet hand because it has functionality and Nihil Spellbomb. That's like the baseline floor for like a really good 7 in matchups like this, but we also have a lot of other things to like, including Gilded Goose turn 1 as an alternative to Spellbomb. And you know what? I did play it, so why? Well, against Dredge, keeping 7, we'd probably be priced into the Spellbomb. Against the opponent's deck, they play more interaction than Dredge does as far as I can tell, and they are also slower to generate an unbeatable board state. So at the risk of them going completely nutty here turn 2, I decide Gilded Goose kind of allows us to deploy our Spellbomb where it's going to get more value for us, and also gives us more options if we decide maybe we don't even need to play the Spellbomb right away. Opponent's turn 2 is tapped Overgrown Tomb, Gravecrawler from hand. So we have 2 Plague Engineers in hand. This was too much to resist, my friends. I decided, you know what? Following the same principle of why I didn't play the Spellbomb turn 1, I think if we have this nice 3-for-1 in our favor here, leaving aside any recursive properties they have, right now it's a 3-for-1, I think that's going to be really good. And I think from there, having set them back so far, we can deploy Spellbomb next turn and then take it from there. But of course, we do run the risk of a really nutty turn 3 on the back of this, but how bad could it really be, right? That was my thinking. Triple Vengevine. They mill 3 cards off the Stixure Supplier. Of course, we have named Zombie with Plague Man, and we wipe their whole board and make sure they're going to stay dead in the case of Gravecrawler until they can answer Plague Man. But then 3 cards get milled, all 3 Vengevines. I'm just thinking, what have I done? What have I done? And the opponent plays the 3rd land, so I'm here just like cringing, waiting to lose. But the opponent doesn't have 2 creatures to play. In fact, maybe they don't even have 1 to play. If they do, they're slow rolling it, maybe trying to double spell next turn to get the Vengevines back. So we dodge a bullet. Maybe that was wrong in retrospect because we have such a strong hand and the potential to just hand them a win, even if it was small, was too much of a risk. But remember, we saw no Vengevines game 1. We saw only one Vengevine, I think, game 2. It's just not a card that, like, is the focal point of the deck based on what we've seen so far. We're more afraid of them setting up stuff like Satyr Wayfinder, Lurrus, killing us with Altar of Dementia, getting big Fiend Artisans down. So on that axis, I like the play that we made, but we could have gotten punished for it. Turns out that we didn't. So feels good, man. So now we're definitely playing the Spellbomb. And now I'm going to choose to play Stoneforge Mystic over Tarmogoyf. Often you'll have a decision where they're both good, and there's, edge case decisions for either one. So opponent makes the 4th land drop, casting a Bloodghast from hand, and casting another Bloodghast from hand, so that explains why they couldn't get the Vengevines back there. Some clunk in their hand, to be sure. So we, of course, Spellbomb in response, wipe their whole graveyard with the Vengevine triggers on the stack. We don't get to draw off it, but I think we'll be okay. We're very far ahead on cards, and the 4th land is ours, so now it's time to go equipment mode here. Flash it in with Stoneforge, equip it to the Plague Man, go to town, hope the discard from hand doesn't hurt us badly, and we just get a land out of there, so that's great. Then we're untapping, and then, I don't know, do we play Plague Engineer, naming Vampire, and lock out like their whole deck? Or do we play 2 Tarmogoyfs in our second main phase, having used 8 mana on our turn 4? I don't know, they both seem really good to me. We just go wide with the Goyfs, trying to get the game ended. OP's draws have been the 5th land and Mishra's Bauble, so some slow stuff. Some non-immediately impactful stuff, but some stuff that represents a bunch of redraws, so basically they play around the sort of Feast and Famine trigger by doing nothing and saying go. We've drawn Fatal Push, we've got Plague Engineer, it's time to just style so hard. Plague Man naming Vampire, not that they could block anyway, but we want to be mana efficient with our sort of Feast and Famine, right? So we leave the Goose back, and we smash in for a whole bunch. The Plague Engineer play also did grow the Goyf, so it was relevant to main phase it. We put them to 2 instead of to 4 that way. And then, of course, as always, we get to untap, so we will re-equip to Stoneforge Mystic. A more obvious thing to do would be to re-equip to Plague Engineer so he can block, but we're not worried about any haste threats, about any blocking. We're worried about them, like, cantripping with Baubles and Peatlands into all of the removal and a way to stabilize the board somehow. So I re-equip to the lowest priority removal target, and also the thing that doesn't get X for 1'd by Maelstrom Pulse. We also are holding up Fatal Push or a Gilded Goose activation, but the opponent needs an absolute miracle not to be overwhelmingly dead. So that's a corner case thing, but I did just think I'd mention it. Opponent's going to draw a bunch of cards, and they've got 4 cards in hand, and they find the Concede match button. So definitely a really cool brew from Tom with 2 M's ACP. Shout out to you. And we brought the overwhelming hate from the side. Again, we have a lot of graveyard hate, or a healthy amount of it. We have a lot of main deck cards that naturally line up well, and we have the additional use of Plague Engineer being nutty. Absolutely nutty in this matchup. So opponent's brew is really cool, looks really strong, but it seems like one that if we're prepared with a sideboard like this, we can roll them up. So we do that after losing a really overwhelming game 1. We roll them up with the sideboard stuff, games 2 and 3. On the play round 3 with a classic on the play hand in that it's very permanent heavy, very threat heavy. Our interaction is probably not the best. If it's Tron, Trophy will be the card to have. Otherwise, we'd rather have other cards, right? So with a hand like that fits those criteria, we'd much rather be on the play, and indeed we are. And we are against a Lava Spike deck. Turn 1, Snow-Covered Mountain. Lava Spike our face. And we've drawn land number 4, so it's either Goyf or Mystic. I do decide to run out the Stoneforge Mystic and say, hey, let's make them kill her. If not, she's got the highest upside. But I also, at the same time, wanted to hedge against them killing her by getting Sword of Fire and Ice, which, let's say, either way, we're assuming that they probably want to kill her, because getting Sword of Fire and Ice doesn't mean that we don't have Batterskull in hand. We could naturally have drawn it. So I'm expecting them to kill her, and with her expected to die, we probably will not be in a position to hardcast Batterskull. We're probably going to win by the time we could with this Tarmogoyf, right? Or lose. Either way, it shouldn't be a factor. So Sword of Fire and Ice could be a factor even if they kill her, right? Opponent has kept a one-lander, they're just going to say go. They don't kill Stoneforge Mystic, so maybe they are biding their time, or maybe they don't have the ability to. I decide that we are going to just see. Thought about playing the Goyf, but based on their sequencing, I thought, okay, let's just pass. They probably don't have removal, so we can maybe get Fire and Ice equipped next turn. I really read them for no removal this whole time, and I think that was probably the correct read. However, things have changed because they play a second land. They shock in a Sacred Foundry, so maybe they have removal now. But having committed to this plan, I think we need to try to see it through. So I'm going to begin the turn by trying to equip Stoneforge Mystic. And hey, if they have to point removal at her, I guess she's done her job, right? So Stoneforge Mystic and eat a Lightning Helix. Again, I think our sequencing could have been rewarded if they didn't draw the second land pretty significantly. And even if they did remove her, the whole plan this entire time was then we get to follow up with a huge Tarmogoyf that is virtually immune to 1-for-1 removal, especially game 1, and also another potential equip target for our cheap equipment. So far, so good with our plan. We're still at 13 life. Our big problem is that our top decks haven't been very good. You know, we've hit the lands, but they've all been painful. It's all either shocks or fetches, and the rest of our hand is not very good at the moment. But we equip Tarmogoyf. No double bolt in response or anything like that, and it's sword time. So Tarmogoyf, they're at 21 life, but Tarmogoyf alone is still a 3-turn clock because we swing for 8, then we tag them for 2. The draw of Fatal Push doesn't really change anything. We're still just holding up reactive spells or low-impact stuff like Last Hope and Souls. Therefore, I decide the order of the day is to take no further damage whatsoever from our lands for any reason. That's going to take something really weird to make me waver from that. OP will end step a Boros Charm, which is really scary, because that puts us to 9. Now we are dead to 3 burn spells. And back to the OP. So note that we would maybe have cast Batterskull. I don't know what would have happened last turn. Maybe we shock in for Batterskull. So I can't really tell right now if we are rewarded or punished for getting Sword of Fire and Ice, right? It really depends on what else is in the opponent's hand. But we've got the opponent on the tight clock. We're still at 9. We draw Stoneforge Mystic. Another card that probably doesn't matter, but now we can go get Batterskull, all right? And then, once again, just taking no damage from our lands, holding up all of our kill spells, and making them kill us with burn. We've got the creatures covered, we just need them to not have 2 more burn spells. They have a Boros Charm on the end step, then they're fetching and shocking, definitely looks like we're dead. Boros charming us in the face, the 3rd Boros charm of the game, and then Shard Volley. So I guess Shard Volley is going to finish us just like any other burn spell would, but this one is leading me to believe that they're playing the card Chandra's Incinerator. Maybe it's just becoming, maybe it's just bleeding into more normal burn decks, but that would be my read off of that. So maybe a little useful information at the end that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise get, but we are sadly defeated. So yeah, just a little bit too reactive. I don't think playing Lingering Souls was ever live there because we would have been taking damage to do so. And I think making the opponent earn every point of damage was a fine line. So maybe the 2 things we could have done were playing Lingering Souls, trying to race them a little harder at the expense of making it easier for them to race us back, and also maybe going shields down with removal on a turn where it could matter. And, of course, they had a no-creature progression, which really punished our, all-removal hand, and also maybe getting Batterskull with Stoneforge Mystic. But remember, at the time, they were stuck on 1 land, and it didn't look like they had a kill spell with that 1 land. It didn't look like they had a Lightning Bolt. So, definitely one that, it's burn. It's intense. Every decision matters a lot, and a lot of it is guesswork when you don't have a discard spell, but they get us good in game 1. All right, it's 5 and 5 out. Path Purge 2 copies of Brutality and a Kaya's Guile are what's in, and the Thoughtseizes, the Lily, the Last Hope, and once again the Lingering Souls get cut. I thought about playing Eidolon of Rhetoric as well. Against Prowess, I definitely would. Against this burn deck, maybe it still should be in. I'm not exactly sure. I said, I don't know, on the play. Like, if you look at our 60, it's actually really impressive against burn. Maybe we'd be cutting a fringe card like Grim Flayer, but we have to race them too. If we're just playing a 3-mana 1/4, and every card they have does 3 or 4 damage, maybe that's not effective enough against burn like it would be against Prowess. So you guys can let me know what you think about that. Either way, we definitely cannot keep this. It's a 1-lander. The 1-land's painful. Not gonna cut it against a burn deck, right? So we have a really average 7, but at least we're on the play. At least we have 3 premier threats. I think this is better than going to 5s. It's not like we have a huge critical mass of specific anti-burn hate. We have only 5 cards that come in, and some of them, like Path and Purge, are just like different forms of removal, right? Yeah. So I'm not really thrilled about going to 5. I think this is keepable on the play. Let's say we've got a Stoneforge Mystic and 2 Tarmogoyfs. Can you beat this burn player? Burn's going to keep 7, and they're going to kick us off with a Goblin Guide. Feels real bad to see that, because we had all the removal rotting in hand last game. This game we've got none, and it represents their best clock if we don't have it. However, we do flip a removal spell. It is kind of the worst one here, Celestial Purge, just because we'd like actually to fill the graveyard right now rather than exile, for the purpose of our Goyfs, but we're holding it up rather than playing out something. I think that's correct here, because obviously we have a target for it, and turn 2 is the biggest turn to watch out for the card Searing Blaze, and all of our stuff would die to Searing Blaze. That's a horrible exchange for us right now, no matter which we play between Goyf and SFM. And the longer you wait, the likelier it is that you will not fall victim to Searing Blaze, because you can draw Inquisition, or maybe the opponent will have a turn where they don't make a land drop, right? So I really like holding up removal here, but the Goblin Guide scouted out our removal last turn, so because we're passing and because we drew this card, they know that's what we're going to do, so they don't even make us... they don't even test our mettle by attacking. They basically say, we know you're going to use it, I'm not attacking, right? Turns out there is a trophy on top, so we wouldn't have got the free land anyway. So our hand continues to be very clunky. At this point, I'm feeling pretty behind, so I decide to risk the SFM again. I do not expect her to live, so once again we get Fire and Ice over Batterskull, and once again that might be debatable. OP's going to Boros Charm our face. They really are good at finding that card, and that's a little bit scary. They then make land drop number 3 on turn number 3, and then go Swifty into Searing Blaze. This is about as painful as I can imagine, especially because our hand is so clunky. So we are down to 9. We are on the ropes, and it is only turn 3. We go down to 8 to fetch, because we're going to have to, and we draw an uncastable 4-drop in the form of Vraska, so... we're single spelling in the face of a burn progression. All we can do is play the Goyf and hope they don't have a way through it, but wouldn't you know it, path to exile. At least it's not burn, alright guys? At least it is not burn. But then they've got the burn, they've got the Lava Spike to follow it up, and the Lava Spike to follow up the first Lava Spike, so it is turn 4. They have turn 4'd us by a lot. We're going to go to 2 when Lava Spike resolves, then we're going to go to -2 when Swifty hits us. So they've not just Xyz'd us, they have gone an extra Goblin Guide hit beyond Xyz's on turn 4 through Celestial Purge while killing Stoneforge Mystic and Tarmogoyf along the way. Not every day you see that, but our progression after the Malta 6 was pretty medium at best. With a hand like that, again, you keep it because it's better than most 5s, and because if there's a gap in their progression, whether they don't have quite enough removal to handle all of our threats, or whether they are kind of stuck on like 1 or 2 lands for a while, or maybe they don't quite have the efficiency to turn for us with a lot of 1-mana burn spells and with a well-timed Searing Blaze. You know, there are ways where we can stabilize and be rewarded for that and turn around and win that game. This was not one of them. We get absolutely crushed. And again, even though maybe you can debate whether or not within the dark there, getting Batterskull is better than Fire and Ice here, our Stoneforge Mystic died right away to Searing Blaze, so it did not matter. We get burned out in round 3, brought back down to earth, despite what I think is a pretty good matchup for us, for our specific Gooseblade configuration. Hope you're enjoying this one, my friends. We are entering round 4 with a hand that I guess is keepable, and I did keep it, but remember what I mentioned about drawing a lot of hands with equipment in the opener. This is definitely a great example of that. But with this keep, we are just hoping they play to the board, because turn 1 push, turn 2 Goyf. This is the best 1-2 punch against a deck playing to the board. Unfortunately, opponent will go Blackcleave Cliffs, Inquisition, taking our Goyf. How rude, and we just draw land off the top. You know, again, the one consolation about having Batterskull rotting in hand is at least you can feel good about drawing more lands than you would otherwise need, right? But OP just taking our hand to pieces with another Inquisition taking Sword of Fire and Ice. Always feels bad. That's one of many reasons it's kind of bad to keep equipment in your opener, but here, you know, in the blind, I decided better than mulling, and of course against a Jund deck or another black-red mid-range deck, which actually right now with Castle Lock Thwain it looks kind of like Rakdos. Mulling against the double Inquisition opener from an attrition deck would be bad too. So, once again we're in a tough spot, but we rip Inquisition off the top. So let's fire it back, give them a taste of their own medicine, take their Tarmogoyf away. They've got 3 lands and a Bloodbraid Elf in hand, so we've got to settle in for a good old-fashioned grind, and it is in fact Jund. So a BGX mirror, a brother war, a civil war, you hate to see it. May the best grinder win, I guess, right? But of course a lot of these do come down to top decks. So Inquisition is our draw. We could fire it off, you know, they could have something in hand, but the odds of that are pretty low. And we know next turn they're almost certainly going to play Bloodbraid Elf. So we have a couple incentives not to Inquisition here, and also just to play that land out and hold up Fatal Push. Number 1, this is one of our only ways to generate Revolt, killing Bloodbraid Elf on our own terms with a Fatal Push. It can otherwise dodge other forms of removal. And also, this gives them now 2 turns to have drawn something that our Inquisition could hit instead of just 1. So, opponent will Bloodbraid into a Lightning Bolt. That's pretty tame, all things considered. Of course, we were hoping for a brick, like Push or Terminate, but we'll take that, right? Bolt not so bad. We draw SFM, definitely going to fire off Inquisition now, but it's a whiff. The opponent found another Bloodbraid Elf, which is scary, and then 2 more lands. Maybe we knew about one of them, but certainly that was a fine Inquisition window, and now we go get our last piece of equipment and hope that these cards can carry us. We'll see what this Bloodbraid Elf is going to show us. Well, it's a really well-timed Inquisition of Kozilek. Great for the opponent to take Feast and Famine, which is otherwise a beating, and a great time to get Inquisition out of their deck, right? So the Bloodbraid definitely looking like a big problem for us, but they do still have to answer the question of Batterskull, and we rip Tarmogoyf off the top. A very well-timed Goyf, if I say so myself. OP will play and crack that Peatland, and they also have Castle Lock Thwain is more draw insurance. I'm then starting to get a little twitchy about like a potential Kolaghan's Command, you know, responding to our activation, forcing us to discard. It's something that, you know, maybe if we haven't played around it by now, maybe we shouldn't play around it, but at the same time, the opponent knows this is our line, so we just get that germ down. OP, Ren and 6, gonna buy back the Peatland. That's a loop we have to put a stop to right away if we can. Sadly, we've drawn Swamp for turn, so let's just hope one of their cards in hand is not a kill spell. Send both of our threats at Ren, and they let it through. So, definitely didn't seem like they had a kill spell to me, but I guess it's possible they valued the Ren less than the Bloodbraid Elf. Wanted to keep a card in hand, seems unlikely though. So we'll just play out our swamp. The reason I do that, it's really nice to conceal information by holding that swamp. Against Jund, that's great. But the 5th land's actually kind of important here, because if they have some kind of removal, we want to be able to remember bounce Batterskull and return it with Stoneforge Mystic, all in the same turn, all at instant speed. So for that reason, we play the 5th land. Sorry, I wanted to make sure my client wasn't going to freeze up on us. And then opponent just main phases a Pulse, and, a timely explanation, I guess, because then we get to bounce it, and the opponent is just going to scoop it up to that. So I don't know if they missed that, or if they didn't know about it. Either way, we get there. Alright guys, it is game 2 of round 4, and I'm actually recording this on a different day from from what you've heard so far in this league. I hope the sound and everything else is just the same for you, but I did have to terminate the recording unexpectedly that we got all the way up to round 4 game 1 conclusion with, but now I'm back to close out the league, and yeah, hope the splicing together goes without a hitch. But anyway, we are sideboarded against Jund, and we have trimmed around the edges with an Inquisition, a Thoughtseize, a Gilded Goose, and a Blooming Marsh on the draw, all making way. The Kaya's Guile is a card I thought about bringing in, and in this case I didn't. I think in maybe a later game I did, but in this case all we have are 2 Spellbombs, the Path and the Celestial Purge, if I'm not mistaken. So we have another equipment-heavy hand. 2 equipment in hand, no Stoneforge Mystic in hand. You hate to see it, but you also hate to mulligan against Jund. These are the 2 best pieces of equipment in the matchup. We've got Decay and Trophy, and 3 lands as functionality. We've drawn Liliana as well, so it's a keep, but it is a clunker, and our saving grace is that in this matchup you can afford some clunk, right? What you cannot afford necessarily is to go too low on resources, and speaking of resource loss or depletion, the opponent will go turn 2 Kroxa here, and I was actually really unsure what to pitch. I ended up erring on the side of leaving my Decays and Trophies around, because I don't want to lose cards out of this hand at all. Like, we need every land, we really want to keep our equipment, and the Decays and Trophies, of course, we'd rather use to trade than just lose to our own Liliana +1, or the opposing Kroxa, or indeed the opposing Liliana, which is a card very much on my radar. So I am saying I don't want to trade resources now unless it's a Decay and a Trophy for their permanents, right? So to that end, I actually pitch my own Liliana, because it doesn't look as though they have a threat. That's not the signal I'm getting from their hand. And also, like I said, our Liliana going down and ticking up, I'm not even sure is that good for us, especially with them on the play, potentially Bloodbraid Elfing on turn 4, right? I also grabbed the wrong land off of the fetch, by the way. It was not a mistake or an oversight, it was a simple misclick. I got too lazy to make the box bigger, and I clicked on Overgrown Tomb when I meant to click on a white land of some kind, but there we have it. So we're whiteless. We've drawn Grim Flayer. We've also drawn a second swamp. Kind of some bad draws. Didn't expect Flayer to live, but we run him out anyway, and, it is what it is. They had the Fatal Push, sure enough. So turn 4 for OP. Bloodbraid Elf into another Kroxa, and these Kroxas are just a nightmare for our specific hand, We, again, want to keep all of our resources until we can start laying down equipment, and the Kroxa is really not allowing that. So I picked Trophy because I'm saying, our progression should be able to beat a Bloodbraid Elf. It should not be the deciding factor. So keeping a Decay around, maybe to kill an escaped Kroxa is fine, or to kill something else more efficiently. And other than that, we're going to keep our permanents, and we're going to keep the lands we need to cast them. We've drawn Thoughtseize, we see Huntmaster and Bloodbraid. It's all pretty scary stuff. Opponent also cascaded past Vraska, so we are not the only ones, right? Not the only ones playing Vraska. I take the Huntmaster over the Bloodbraid simply because Huntmaster does kind of punish us for pitching Trophy. It is a card that has guaranteed ability to snowball the game, whereas their Bloodbraid Elf could have an underwhelming hit, or even a bit of a brick. Rather than laying out the sword, I decide to hold up Decay here, reasoning, I thought anyway, they were pretty likely to escape Kroxa here based on the sequencing that we've that we've showed them. That was my thinking, right? Based on our sequencing, they're more likely to escape Kroxa, leave Bloodbraid Elf in hand, but I was wrong. They go for a Bloodbraid Elf, and they're rewarded for what could have been a bad cascade with Brutality taking our Decay. So we are getting punished at almost every turn here, and now we've drawn Lingering Souls, which is kind of bad, made a lot worse by my incorrect fetch, and now here comes Kroxa. But the upside, hey, we get a pretty free pitch to Kroxa. That's not nothing, but we are getting junded out pretty hard here and doing almost nothing. So the equipment keep, we felt priced into it, and it proves to be very, very underwhelming. The opponent has all of the right interaction for our stuff or to strip away our interaction at the right times. It's possible that I did us no favors with some of the decisions we made here, but frankly, with our keep against their progression, I don't think any permutation of like what to pitch to Kroxas and anything else related to those types of decisions was going to get us there. So, we have seen some keeps with heavy equipment presence where we draw the right cards and we're rewarded for not going low on resources. This was kind of the opposite. Our equipment, they were technically permanents, they were technically value sitting in hand, but they accomplished exactly nothing as the opponent junded us out. So kind of the binary, the pros and cons of Stoneforge Mystic package, very much evident in this league. We lose game 2 on the back of that. Let's go to game 3. So our incentives change enough on the play to have made a few changes. The Blooming Marsh comes back because cutting a land is much freer on the draw statistically than it is on the play. A Gilded Goose makes way to accommodate the return of Blooming Marsh, and on top of that, we have brought in the Kaya's Guile as an additional form of removal and Graveyard Hate, which, as you saw, the Kroxas were really impactful there against us, and we cut a third discard spell to accommodate those changes. Despite going back up to our full land count, we open on a 1-lander with a high curve and no black production. So back it goes. Hate to do it against Jund, but this is a very acceptable hand. I just wish it was our 7. But we are going to have to keep 6, and we are going to have to bottom 1. I think it's between the higher upside but higher risk play of bottoming a land and the safer but worse against heavy depletion or attrition play of bottoming Grim Flayer. I go for the safer option here. Sadly, waving goodbye to the namesake, the mascot of the channel, the on-field general, the one of Grim Flayer, goes back to the bottom of the library. What can you do? Not the match, or not the league, rather, where we're seeing very much at all of the Flayer, but the opponent has mulliganed to 6 as well, and now that we're on card parity, I actually like our Spellbomb Stoneforge Liliana hand very well. We have drawn Gideon, ally of Zendikar. Hey, if we hit a 4th land, that is a bomb in the matchup, no doubt about it, but it's SFM time, and we are going to get Sword of Feast and Famine, which I do believe has kind of been the all-star equipment of the league so far. We'll see if we can put it to good use here against Jund. Opponent will grab Blood Crypt, and then Shock and Stomping Ground, and just another Collective Brutality like we saw last game. This time, instead of taking a look at our hand, it's just a 1-for-1ing Stoneforge Mystic, which is fair enough. We draw Batterskull. Not the first time, not the last time. I think that the natural draw of equipment is really, really awkward. Kind of like last game, we don't really want to tick up with Liliana. Remember what I said in the deck tech about how one of my first thoughts was like turn 2 Lily of the Veil off of Gilded Goose is what I want to do with this deck. It's amazing, and that's very true, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of hands where her +1 is not free, especially because we moved away from the 3rd and 4th Lingering Souls. We're seeing a lot of that in this match, right? So this time, though, being on the play and with the opponent having mulliganed, I think it is correct to jam Lily and just accept the consequences. And, whoops, we don't want to hit play quite yet. And in this case, the consequences are we lose a Batterskull and they pitch a Kroxa. So that's a losing trade for us. However, the opponent does not have a play or a 3rd land drop, so experiencing a fail rate for sure. And we hit our 4th land drop, which is amazing. It is Gideon time. Gideon, ally of Zendikar. Too good to pass up, but Sword of Feast and Famine is also too good to pitch, so we just do not activate Liliana. Would be nice to have our cake and eat it too, but I think that's definitely the play there. Opponent stumbling is over. They hit land number 3, so what will they manage to do with it? Let's see, it is Tarmogoyf and then pass. So I don't understand their play. Clearly, either the land or the Tarmogoyf was a draw this turn. Maybe they have other things to do and they didn't just want to walk the Tarmogoyf out and do a Liliana Edict. That's probably the only explanation, but whatever the case, the draw of the third land for some reason spurs them to doing so. Maybe they have 4 drops in hand. That could be an explanation. They're going to start trying to chew through the Liliana that way if they can hit another land drop. I'm not certain. Maybe have Kolaghan's Command to finish Lily off. Couldn't tell you. But what I can tell you is that we have drawn our 5th land, so things are going really well. And therefore, I think the play is definitely to just hard cast and attempt to equip Feast and Famine, because the upside is so high. And the risk, quote-unquote, is not really risk at all. They could have Bolt or Push for our Knight, and they do. Sure. You know what? They just had to spend a card in the face of 2 active Planeswalkers on a token that our Planeswalker makes. So that's really good for us. And following that same principle, we use Gideon just to make another token. Obviously, animating him and getting in is worth considering, but with Sword of Feast and Famine around, I definitely like making the Knight. In general, it's a good principle in these grindy matchups anyway. So we're afraid of Kolaghan's Command, we're afraid of, Bloodbraid and Decay Command would be the worst. We're not so much afraid of Kroxa, even though it's pretty good for the opponent, clawing them back some value. They still have a massive advantage in terms of cards in hand, and even though the Kroxas almost single-handedly beat us last game, here, if it comes down to it, we can just cash in Liliana to deal with it, reset their graveyard to a low amount, and go to town with our board, and that's what we're going to do. We've only drawn a land, though, so can we still have a good turn? Well, I would say the answer is probably yes. So here's how we sequence. We're going to equip, and then we're going to fetch main phase before our damage resolves. So we basically are going to get to untap that fetch land along with the lands that we used, or the fetched land, I should say, along with the lands that we used to equip. We're also going to fire up Gideon and put them all the way down to 2. Getting crazy here. All of a sudden, Gideon plus his Knight ally threatening to end the game out of absolutely nowhere. We get to untap, and we get a card out of their hand. So having untapped, we now will crack Spellbomb, getting maximum cards out of their graveyard, giving ourselves maximum mana to work with. And look at that, Lingering Souls, probably relevant for just about the first time in this league, but how relevant it is. The opponent, short of a Damnation, which is not meta at all anymore, cannot possibly beat Gideon and the Sword and the Knight, and now 4 Spirit tokens while they're at 2, and indeed, after the draw step, they will scoop it up. So we turn the tables on Jund here in Game 3, on the back of Sword of Feast and Famine and Gideon, ally of Zendikar more than anything else, but Liliana was really good there. Nihil Spellbomb is always good in these types of situations. It was just a real white Jund moment, or a junk moment, or a Gooseblade moment, whatever you want to conceive of it. We get there, we cash the league, and let's play round 5. The longer this league goes on, the more often Batterskull shows its ugly face in our opening hand. We don't need to see it there. We like to bury it deep in the deck to be tutored when necessary, right? Despite that recurring awkwardness, this is a nice keep. We also, have no white, so that sucks, but we're on the draw. And we don't necessarily need white all that early, and we have some good early interaction, Inquisition, Decay, Trophy, and the opponent will lead on Blackleaf Cliff's Inquisition, taking our recurring value permanent Liliana the Last Hope. So that feels bad, but we draw another Inquisition, so the attrition is on, and the opponent, I guess, had mulliganed to 6, and then we're going to Inquisition them, seeing 2 more lands, including Raging Ravine. Angrath's Rampage, which is an interesting choice in a Jund deck, especially main deck, sacrifices an artifact, creature, or planeswalker. The target player does, that is. Sorcery, speed, black-red. So, that card we don't care about whatsoever right now, and even if we did, it would still probably be correct to get Liliana out of there. We are, after all, looking to win the grind. We draw Tarmogoyf, so let's Inquisition. We can take away the Rampage if there's no more pressing issue, but as it turns out, there is a much more pressing issue. It is Seasoned Pyromancer, so we are certainly priced into taking him away, because if we don't, we get rid of the removal, but then they just go land, Spyro, ditch 1 card, draw 2, maybe make a token, maybe not. Either way, it's bad for us. So OP's going to play their land. We're going to miss our third land. That's pretty rough. You hate to see that. So back to OP. They're going to make their land drops. And then it is back over to us. We're just drawing high curve stuff. No lands in sight. Just playing some draw go. We are accumulating resources, though. And at this point, I'm starting to say that trophying the Ravine is on my radar, but I don't want to necessarily do it yet. At some point, it will be correct to stop doing nothing with our turns and just, like, trophy the Ravine. They'll have to draw Renin 6 to punish us for it, right? So I hold off on doing that for a turn. But now, with enough to do in my hand, I'm saying, okay, depending on our draw next turn, maybe it's time to just start using our cards, like running a Goyf out into Rampage, whatever. Hopefully we won't have to. But we have now drawn the third land. So even though the third land doesn't let us cast anything proactively this turn that survives a Rampage, it gives me hope that I'm going to continue to be okay playing a little draw go, right? Because then if we draw the fourth land, we can cast Vraska, and that's going to be interesting, and so you understand the ideas here, right? End step, opponent has made some elemental tokens. They're going to get busy in the attack step, and then opponent has drawn Renin 6, instantly punished. And, at least it gives us something else to do with our turn. We'll decay the Ren, but losing out on the trade value-wise, the opponent's clawing back a little bit of parity, but we're still overwhelmingly ahead on advantage. The big problem now is board presence, because they've got their Ravine back. They've drawn a Tarmogoyf. They still have this answer in their hand to our Tarmogoyf, and we could just, fail to draw the right cards here before it's time for us to get aggroed out. So a note on fetching. Basically, if I have been in a position where we will definitely not have the time or luxury to cycle a land for 3 mana, as was the case against Burn, or if we're in a position where we cannot afford an ETB tapped land for almost any reason, which is the case now under pressure, I go get the Triome. If it's more of a grindy match where we do have a higher land count, I will fetch other lands and leave Triome in the deck as flood insurance if we are to draw a land, right? So just, again, a quick note on fetching. That does give us access to white, and we draw Stoneforge Mystic, but instead I think it's correct here to Pulse the Goyf, because that's our only removal for Goyf, shy of drawing a fourth land for Vraska, and that opens up the idea of playing our Goyf and not potentially pulsing both Goyfs away, right? Sadly, OP with a perfectly timed Thoughtseize here, taking away our Goyf, breaking what would have potentially been our ability to stymie this board, and it's 1 mana interaction that not only was relevant in and of itself, it allowed them to activate Ravine, and we are just continuing to draw bad stuff. The draw of an equipment, even our MVP equipment, is not welcome here. At this moment in time, we need something to stabilize the board, and we don't have it. An opponent, once again, with kind of the perfect top deck for the situation. They draw Seal of Fire, which of course is Exacties to Stoneforge Mystic, while also allowing them to attack with Ravine. So if they had been drawing 2 mana interaction, that would have been 9 less points of damage for us. We draw Gilded Goose, we're just dead. So this was one of those low agency mid-range mirrors, BGX mirrors, where, we made some decisions technically. Our Inquisitions were kind of obvious, though, in terms of what to take, in my view, and we got severely punished for just, missing a land drop for too long. The opponent's draws really allowing them to maximally pressure us and punish our stumbling. Not much more to say about it. Feels bad to lose a game 1 like that, but we did. Just the slightest of tweaks from the previous Jund sideboarding on the play. We just are leaving in a Gilded Goose. We're leaving in the second Goose and taking out the 4th discard spell. It's just a little bit of tweaking. I think the 4th discard spell in the form of Inquisition is roughly as powerful overall as the second Gilded Goose. You can find good windows and really bad windows for both, right? But just a minor tweak, you could go either way. Also, Ashiok is one that I've left in the sideboard. I think sometimes it's correct to bring Ashiok in against Jund as a one-of, especially on the play, but it depends more on your own configuration rather than a hard and fast rule of, yes, Ashiok is good against Jund, or no, it is bad against Jund, right? And in this case, I felt we had enough to do and enough ways to compete on all the axes we want to without leveraging Ashiok, who can be very, very low impact if it's not lining up favorably, right? So OP will mulligan to 6, we'll go Gilded Goose on the play, we'll see what they've got, and it's an Inquisition, so we lose Feast and Famine, once again opening on equipment in hand and getting punished for it. Again, if there is one thing that's happening an unusual amount this league, I would say it's probably that overall, right? But we are going to go ahead and grab Basic Plains, play the Spellbomb, say go. OP will run a Tarmogoyf out. They know about Archaea's Guile, so I guess they're okay with this trade. But we've got an even better way to take care of Goyf as we rip Liliana off the top. So, with a Silent Clearing in hand, remember we don't need much more than one green source, and we have the Goose around to make more food, or even just to use this food if we need it. I decide to lean into our basics to protect our life total. I'm remembering getting aggroed out last game, right? And remember, as we have before, we are actually holding up the Spellbomb cantrip with Gilded Goose. So, OP's turn, they will just Lightning Bolt Liliana. By the way, some nice 10th edition basics from OP. Always love to observe the basic game out of the other side. And then after the Liliana gets bolted, another Goyf comes down. Once again, they kind of know about the Kaya's Guile, right? So we are going to exile their graveyard. They have to sacrifice a creature. This will happen in the order that it's written on the card. So first the Goyf is sacked, then the graveyard is exiled. So we leave them with a clean slate, which is really good for us. And unfortunately, we are kind of out of ideas. And the main phase bolt that they pointed at Liliana shows that they do probably have a pretty stacked hand. So I don't know, you know, our stuff is lined up pretty well so far, but I can't really say that we're ahead, right? So under these circumstances, sometimes in the past you will have seen me say, okay, let's just cantrip with a Spellbomb. We need action. Today, in this spot, I was feeling like I want to take it a little bit more slowly, right? I was feeling like I want to be a little more disciplined. You could go either way, but I said, okay, let's just put our faith in the top deck. The top deck shows us a swamp, so we crack Peatland, and we see a Verdant Catacombs. So faith, not rewarded, never rewarded. We just have to cantrip because we're going to flood if we don't, right? Or I guess more accurately, we're going to flood either way, so we got to get through the flood faster, right? So that feels pretty bad. And now, after having seen 3 straight bricks off the top, now we're just going to use the Spellbomb as a cantrip. And we draw Trophy, which is something, and Temple Garden, which is virtually nothing. So, okay, looking a little sketchy here, my friends. But we are at 16 life, and in the spirit of remaining disciplined, I decide, you know what, I'm just going to take the hit. Getting hit for 5 sucks, but we can gain 3 life with the food here. We probably won't find a better use case for that anyway. So we're really only taking 2, and then we can just wait and see what the opponent does, what they have, maybe prompt them to cast a discard spell, and we get to blow them out, but they don't do anything. So back to us. We rip Stoneforge Mystic, love to see that, and I'm just going to go get Batterskull, make them punish us for having a uncastable this turn card in hand. So back to the OP. Tarmogoyf coming across, so if our Batterskull is going to take over this game, we need to kill the thing that outsizes it, plus I don't want to take a second hit, so point the trophy at it. Trophy resolves. You know, at any given point, it's kind of like you could get blown out by Veil of Summer, but doesn't seem like they have it. It's not as expected in Jund due to the non-bow with Bloodbraid Elf potentially cascading into it. Opponent will then main phase terminate. So they're main phasing terminate on our Squire effectively, even though they know that we have Batterskull in hand and they obviously see that we can hardcast it. What does that mean? Well, to me, that means they have a way to destroy Batterskull. And if we had Stoneforge Mystic around, maybe it's a pillage and it's going to be harder for them to find a window for it, or maybe it is still just like an instant speed Kolaghan's command that they can do whenever. But then remember, we've got the trick of bouncing Batterskull and then putting it back down, all on the back of Stoneforge Mystic, potentially making it much harder for them to destroy our Batterskull. So my read of that Terminate is they want us to just slam our Batterskull and then they're going to destroy it while we are shields down on the bounce. So if we had drawn a brick for turn, maybe I would have said, well, that sucks, but let's make them have it and let's try it. Better than losing it to a Thoughtseize or something, right? But we draw another Stoneforge Mystic, so that actually allows us for a different window. That is still good if they don't have a Shatter effect, but is also playing around K-Command by just fetching and then subsequently hardcasting Sword of Fire and Ice. So this allows them a lot of good use cases with the K command. They're definitely going to shatter this, and then they can shock and kill the Stoneforge Mystic, or they can make us discard. Anticipating that, I leave the Swamp in hand, right? Because that's another way to protect Batterskull, but the opponent instead buys back Tarmogoyf, which is definitely fair enough. So still a really good K command for OP, but we have managed to protect our Batterskull from all of the predators out there that are able to answer it in Jund, including this Kroxa. The Swamp in hand definitely saving us there. And the opponent still, they've done a lot over the last couple turns. They still had 2 cards in hand. One of them was a land, the other is a Tarmogoyf that we already knew about. So can our top deck provide? No, it cannot. It's another fetch land. Ooh, pretty scary. Feels bad. This is getting right down to it, my friends, and the OP draws a Seal of Fire, which came at a really good time last game, and it frankly comes at a pretty decent time this game if they're going to find it at this late stage. After Goyf goes to attacks, they're going to seal the Stoneforge, so of course we flash the Batterskull in. Goyf will grow to a 6/7, and we are not going to jump, and we are not going to just assign a block, then bounce, then recast. Of course, I want a non-summoning sick germ to attack them next turn, right? So that's what we're going to do, and our draw for turn is Fatal Push. So that's obviously really good. But note that if we just fire off the push right now, that actually just gives them 5 cards in the graveyard. They can escape Kroxa. So even though, again, there's an outside chance we get blown out by Veil of Summer or whatever, I decide to hold the push to see what they draw for a turn and what they do. And we are extremely rewarded for this because the opponent plays Liliana of the Veil, which is the top deck, rather than escaping Kroxa. So we are just going to bounce the Batterskull in response, and then Fatal Push the Goyf, and the opponent is going to be able to escape Kroxa next turn, but we have staved that off for 1 turn. Now it's time to throw the Batterskull out there, and then we've drawn another Stoneforge Mystic, so there's no real reason not to play her. However, she is a simple Squire, but, in the face of Liliana, the Squire could definitely become relevant, right? Liliana goes back up to 2, OP's drawn a brick for turn themselves in the form of a land, and then it's Kroxa time. Kroxa's going to escape. Kroxa's going to put us down to 4. What can we do? So we draw some removal for Kroxa. We are all set. Oh no, it's Liliana the Last Hope. She's been so good this league. She's been really good this league, but right here, I just wish she was Liliana of the Veil. That would make things a lot easier. We'd be in pole position if she was. But she's our play, so we're going to play her, and then we're going to blind mill, and we are basically just hoping to hit a Tarmogoyf, and wouldn't you know it, the last card we blind mill, it's a Goyf. It's a Goyf, never didn't have it, and specifically Goyf was the request there because it outsizes Kroxa. So now we've got Stoneforge Mystic to absorb the Liliana of the Veil Edict. We've got our Germ Batterskull around. We've got Goyf as a 6/7. So the opponent's got to top deck something. And mind you, we're also dead to burn because they can attack with Kroxa. The trigger will resolve, will go to 1. Then they burn us before we get to assign a block with lifelink, right? So we're pretty well positioned against a lot of things, but we're dead to some things. And then they rip kind of an in-between thing. It's an Assassin's Trophy. Our specific sequence forced us to go shields down, right? If instead of drawing the Last Hope we had just ripped a natty Goyf, well, then we just play the Goyf, and we could have, of course, bounced the Batterskull in response. However, That's not what happened, and now it is time for us to try to beat the Kroxa without help of Batterskull and indeed beat the Liliana. So Kroxa doesn't attack into the Goyf, doesn't throw himself away to put us to 1, and we draw Maelstrom Pulse for turn. What a beautiful draw. So take Last Hope up, no reason not to, but then of course we just go ahead and pulse the big guy. And then we go to attacks. Now, there is a lot of appeal to just putting them down to 2 here, right? But I decided it was responsible to attack Liliana off the field because then we're super soft to any removal spell, even Seal of Fire, right? So, the opponent's life total lives to fight another day, and it means we don't have a 2-turn clock exactly. Feels bad, but the opponent doesn't do anything, back over to us, and then boom, the attacks put them down to 1. We drew another brick for turn. Once again, there's a non-zero incentive to cash in Lily of the Veil, Lily the Last Hope, to buy back either like something somewhat inconsequential like Gilded Goose or Stoneforge Mystic, maybe try to mill over another high-impact threat. I decided, let's just keep her around. Let's make the opponent beat our board, and if they do, maybe keeping her around will let us keep grinding them out. Note also that cashing her in to put Planeswalker in the yard doesn't grow the Goyf because they already have one in the yard, right? So a whole lot going on here. Back to the opponent, and their last 2 draws have not been good enough to beat the 7-8 Goyf with the assist from Squire. So Last Hope, again, even though that was like the situation that was most emblematic of why it can be bad even to play her as a 1-of compared to the 4th Liliana who would have just edicted Kroxa, we still managed to win in large part off the back of her. Ticking up was fine, it's a good defensive play, but she milled over, she bought us back a Goyf, life is good. So we get there game 2 against Chund, on the ropes, super grindy, we come out ahead. Okay, game 3, playing for that 4-1. As I did in the previous round, we shave a Blooming Marsh on the draw, put a discard spell back in. Pretty easy peasy, but this hand is not so easy. If we could draw a Blooming Marsh right off the top, or frankly any black land at all, this would be an amazing hand. But we've got 2 lands, and we've got 4 of our 5 spells are black. And the 5th one is Tarmogoyf, which can be very good in the matchup, but is generally not something that is great to run out turn 2 on the draw. Too often you walk into a Lily of the Veil Edict, and also if we can't cast any other spells, we can't even grow our Goyf reliably, right? So if the opponent doesn't grow it for us, we might have 1 very low impact spell and the rest rotting in hand. So if we just, and we have 19 black sources, so it feels so bad. Now, granted, we sided 1 out, but it's still 18 black sources. That is 90+% consistency of getting 2 by turn 3. Couldn't even open on 1 in the opener. That feels pretty bad. But we mulligan to a keepable 6, but this is one of the strangest 6s the deck has to offer. Unlike the previous hand, it has no interaction whatsoever. But it does play 3 2-for-1s in the form of Stoneforge Mystic. Technically, the Goose is a 2-for-1 as well, so you know what? Better than going to 5. We're going to keep it. And there are a lot of opposing progressions where they can maybe handle like 1 Stoneforge Mystic, but maybe not the 2nd, and definitely not the 3rd, right? They need to have really the right half of the deck to beat Stoneforge Mystic specifically in order to just like run this hand over no contest. So we'll run out Gilded Goose, and the opponent will actually Fatal Push it on our end step. It's a good efficient play for them, but I'm thinking that's wonderful because, they've got 3 Stoneforges to beat, and if they use a push on Goose, they're just that much likely to be able to do so. However, they've got the turn 2 Tarmogoyf, and now that's a little bit scary, because the one thing I'm worried about is them having like enough interaction and enough of the right half of the deck to just run us over before we can stabilize with 1 of these 3 Stoneforges. So that's my thinking, but we play out 1 of the Stoneforges, we'll get the Batterskull, and Goyf will crack us for 3, then they'll play a Scavenging Ooze. So we draw Liliana of the Veil. Not a bad spot for her, but also I'm thinking it's probably better to make them have an answer to Batterskull. That is definitely pretty decent, especially because it allows us to double spell, getting a Nihil Spellbomb down since we've drawn the 3rd land. So what we're really hoping is to see the OP do anything but just play a land and go to attacks, because if they do that, they're either punting or they have an answer to Batterskull. But with our hand, having mulliganed, being on the draw, having just more Stoneforges in hand, basically, we have to do this. We have to make them have something, and indeed they do. It's Trophy. So not very good for us at all. We go get another swamp, even though we already have 2 black, simply because efficiency is the name of the game right now. And it's not only going to let us generally cantrip with Spellbomb this turn, it is also going to let us do it right now, shrink the Goyf by 1. Every point of damage does matter. The OP has a goose to eat, but chooses not to. I guess it wouldn't increase the damage, so we can't necessarily read into that, because it would shrink the Goyf by 1, even as it grows the goose by 1. Then we just draw another Liliana of the Veil. It seems like okay, but once again I'm saying we have removal in hand. Using a trophy is roughly as good as a Liliana Edict, and once again it's making the opponent beat Stoneforges. We have to get the Stoneforges online as soon as possible because we have no other way to stem this tide. And unfortunately for us, opponent goes Bloodbraid into Lightning Bolt. It's kind of like the perfect aggro turn 4 play. But they point it upstairs rather than at the board, so this actually does give us kind of an interesting window. So this is what we do. We trophy the Goyf. We've kind of got to do that no matter what. And then we're going to see if they have a second forest to get to make the ooze bigger. They don't. They've got a second mountain to get. So sure, that means we can actually double block the ooze here, kill it in combat, only lose 1 Stoneforge Mystic, and then we're at 1, and we're still facing down Ravine and Bloodbraid Elf, so we're in some trouble. But I think this actually gives us more of a chance than we previously looked like we would have in the face of that Cascade. So we'll go to blocks, we'll do that. But Assassin's Trophy, one last time in the league, coming back to bite us because it gave the opponent that untapped land. And then they've got Bolt. Insult to injury, the opponent doesn't just point it upstairs and kills us. They point it at the board. So is that like a power move or is it a misplay? I don't know. It really doesn't matter because we just pretty much lose anyway, right? But we'll play out another Stoneforge. We'll get the final weapon and we'll make the opponent attack us. We'll make the opponent go for it. There's nothing they don't have. They've got Maelstrom Pulse too. So we're well and truly defeated here. Despite the food, threatening potentially to keep us alive, but if they had removal or if they had a Raging Ravine, they've just got us dead to rights. I guess we're bluffing double Fatal Push there, but beyond that, we got nothing. So kind of a bad one because we gave up a free win, in kind of a feel-bad one, I should say, because we gave up a free win in Game 1 of this final round, just because the opponent's progression was pretty perfect relative to what they needed. Again, the 1 mana interaction that was really relevant while being exactly cheap enough to allow them to keep attacking with Raging Ravine when we were struggling to make land drops. And then here in Game 3, opening on a really nice 7, but one that had to be mulliganed due to a lack of black mana. And then opening on the weirdest 6 that the opponent really did have just about every answer for, so it could have got us there. Another way to have sequenced besides what I did here is just to play Lilianas of the Veil at every earliest opportunity in Edict with them. I don't think that was necessarily better in a vacuum. In practice, it might have worked out better for us, but it simply would have, if for no other reason than their curve was so good in that aggressive disruptive role, like aggro backed by disruption is what they needed, it's what they had. But maybe, if the Liliana edicts something and then draws an attack from something, maybe that would have been good enough. So that's the alternative line. And then maybe after the dust settles a little bit, we could stick a Stoneforge Mystic and we'd have just enough time to get her online. I have no idea. But that was the other line to point out in that situation, the other kind of strategy to adopt. But either way, they do Jund us out. They avenge the Jund player from round 4, and we sadly do not secure the 4-1, but we do secure a nice result, a cashed league for Abzan Gooseblade. Alright guys, so as for our wrap-up, the Jund matches seem even-ish. If there's a world in which they're forced to move a little bit away from Kolaghan's command and or pillage, which I don't foresee, I don't see why that would be the case, and shy of some decks cropping up and becoming tier 1 that those cards don't line up well against and they need slots for other things. But should that happen, the matchup could even become favorable for us. As it is, I think it's about 50-50, maybe even slightly favoring Jund. So we, at the same time, the losses that we did have were pretty much down to bad variance. But on the other hand, so are the wins. BGX mirrors, what are you going to do? I don't think we are unfavored against Burn at all. You think of how Rock feels really quite solidly favored against Burn. Not extremely, but like it's a firm, like, yes, we're favored feel when we're on Rock. So on a deck like ours, yes, we have more painful mana, and yeah, that actually does really suck a lot of the time. It's going to force more mulligans, if you can't afford to operate off of a 2 or 3 lander, and maybe with a silent clearing involved, stuff like that. Obviously, the shocks and the fetches add up. But on the other hand, we are main decking 3 Gilded Goose. We didn't get to do it here, but I have just, overwhelmed Burn in the past by trading resources, putting them into top deck mode, and then churning out food tokens with Geese, and they can't recover from that. If they can't answer the Goose, maybe they have to point a burn spell at the Goose, and the Goose will have gained us maybe 6 life, and ETBs makes a food, maybe made 1 other food before they took care of it, stuff like that. That's amazing for a 1-drop, and we have Stoneforge Mystic tutoring up Batterskull, and Sword of Fire and Ice as the case may be. We also have Vraska Golgari Queen for some additional main deck life gain, plus we've got a decent amount in the side, and you can always play more. So losing to Burn felt unlucky more than anything else. I don't know that it was representative of this deck at all. I would be pretty happy to be drawn against a high number of Burn decks with our particular build, and we weren't even really dedicated to beating Burn. When we're playing Eidolon of Rhetoric, Celestial Purge, Path to Exile, these white cards are all better against Prowess than they are against Burn. Prowess is more of a deck to beat, so, if you want, you could pack a couple Weather the Storms in the place of, a couple of these cards. The Duress, unfortunately, we didn't really get to use. That could go. I thought it was a good fit. I think it's a spicy inclusion. There's a lot of matchups where we do want it. We are kind of a high curve deck, so it feels good to fit a low curve card in there, but the point is there's room to make the Burn matchup even better, and I think it's already fine. So the losses are winnable, is what I'm saying here, and for the wins, our deck looked great. So Gilded Goose is still, I would say, not a must-have, but I think it did well enough here that it also is not beyond the pale in terms of an inclusion. We had some really good moments off of it with turn 2 Plague Engineer, or just, getting generic value off of it. In some other testing games, I had hilarious moments where the Goose is suited up with a sword and is flying over a stalled board. It's definitely got a lot to like. At the same time, it's worth just revisiting Abzan Stoneblade in general and saying, okay, number 1, can we refine a list with Geese in it? And if so, how so? And number 2, what would the list look like without Geese? Remember, these are 3 slots that we could put, just about anything in, really. And at the same time, if we are taking Geese away, maybe we cannot afford to lean quite as heavily into the Planeswalkers. Gideon was awesome whenever we drew him. Liliana the Last Hope was really good here in my eyes. I think she'll probably go on the thumbnail. I think she's a really good inclusion here. Other stuff around the edges, unfortunately, we didn't really get to use Grim Flayer. We didn't really get to see Lingering Souls too much, but the core of the deck was awesome. Fatal Push, I really think we got rewarded for leaning on this card more than on Path to Exile. I think the discard was amazing, and Stoneforge Mystic, Tarmogoyf, really tough to argue with the performance of either of those cards. Although, again, as we saw, there is a risk of drawing too many pieces of equipment in opening hands, which started happening kind of more and more in the second half of the league, particularly Batterskull, which is the worst one to open on. So it might be cool to, conceive of a way to somehow buy back artifacts. I'm just thinking of this now, so I don't have great ideas off the top of my head. Does Pulse of Marasa, what does that let us return? Well, I guess we should probably spell it correctly if we're going to find that out, right? Owls of Marasa, not quite. Pulse of Marasa. Does this buy back any permanent? Creature or land, so that's going to be a no. That's kind of like a borderline playable card in BGX anyway. If that could buy back an artifact, that'd be pretty sweet. This is definitely not going to be correct, but this is another one that's just popping into my head. Glissa the Traitor. This would be, like, pretty sweet. Maybe in a Lurrus build, if we're, like, playing Lurrus and a lower curve Stoneblade package. And, of course, Mishra's Bauble. Glissa the Traitor. First strike, death touch, 3/3 for 3. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may return target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. Yeah, that's more of like a semi-combo piece than like a true, you know, like realistic buyback value engine in attrition matchup. So I'm just coming up with janky ideas off the top of my head, but you understand the point here. The point is that it is kind of interesting to conceive of like how we could possibly mitigate the downside of the Stoneforge package and maximize the upside. And one way would be to have some way that's playable to buy back the artifacts, therefore making them less of a liability in opening hands, especially in attrition matchups. So much to think about. Seems like we didn't see a lot of the cards here, like we didn't choke anybody out, we didn't use Eidolon of Rhetoric, but a lot of the cards from the sideboard did show up big. Plague Man, Spellbomb, Ashiok, these cards were all awesome. Kaya's Guile had a few moments too, so yeah, I'm, you know, only a 3-2, a somewhat modest result, but a fine one. Remember, Abzan puts up, like, no results, so it's not like this is a top archetype at all. I think it's underrated, I think it's underplayed, and I think Gilded Goose proved itself as a potential candidate for refining the deck moving forward. So Guillaume, Udaye, Laurent, I think this is hopefully what you had in mind. Some good old Gilded Goose-based brewing and playing. I hope you enjoyed it, my friend. Thank you once again for your generous support. This video was for you. Thank you once again as well to all of the fine patrons who were on the stream helping brew this list. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope some of you will play it, and, you know, I hope somebody takes it to the very top one day. Finally, thank you once again to new Unearthed tier member Moat and new Confidant Eric Dawson. Really appreciate your support, guys, and I hope to see everybody out there playing some kind of a Stoneblade deck at some point or another. If you're a BGX player, and, you know, I understand that cost is a factor, so if you don't have the cards and you don't want to buy them, fair enough. But if you're like a Jund player or a Rock player, it really is a cool change of pace to continue playing the BGX shell with all the black-green cards that are core that we know and love, but having Stoneforge Mystic at your disposal. I wouldn't want to do it like every time I play. You know, the play pattern can get a little bit repetitive, but as a change of pace, it's very cool, very refreshing, and as we demonstrated today, very, very potentially powerful. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about the list, and I hope to see you for the next video. Please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you could do all three, if you have not done the latter, that helps me greatly. Appreciate everybody doing stuff like that. And yeah, see you for the next video. Good luck out there, and I'll talk to you soon.